Hey everyone, and welcome back to another explainer. I am super excited to have you here today because we've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover. We're going to dive into a highly structured exploration of the incredibly interconnected and honestly sometimes totally chaotic events shaping our world right now in May 2026. We are going to connect the dots between geopolitics, economics, public health, and cutting-edge tech to really see the big picture of how our modern world operates when it's put under immense pressure. Okay, so to make sense of today's deeply complex news cycle, we need to use a specific framework. We're talking about a polycrisis. Now, a polycrisis isn't just a bunch of bad stuff happening at the exact same time. It's a cluster of related global risks with compounding effects, where the overall impact actually exceeds the sum of each individual part. It's basically the ultimate domino effect, where a sudden shock in one sector rapidly and unpredictably destabilizes another. So here is our game plan for this explainer. We're going to trace the clear cause and effect links across 5 distinct themes. We'll hit the global energy shock, then flashpoints and fractures, the inequality gap, a cruise ship contagion, and we'll wrap up with regulating the future. All right, let's jump right in. Section 1, the global energy shock, geopolitics and the price of power. Right now, localized clashes, like US and Iranian forces exchanging fire in the Strait of Hormuz, or those recent drone strikes on civilian sites in the UAE, are sending absolute shockwaves through global energy markets. Just think about this single, undeniable number for a second, 89.4%. That is India's massive crude oil import dependency for the 2024 to 2025 fiscal year. When you rely on the global market for practically 90% of the energy that powers your entire nation, any disruption in a critical choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, which processes 45% of those imports, well, that's not just a distant foreign policy issue anymore, is it? It becomes a direct, immediate threat to your domestic stability. And the data here really paints a picture of how nations are forced to tactically pivot just to survive. Look at how India has radically restructured its supply lines. Russia now captures a staggering 36% slice of India's energy imports that skyrocketed from just 2% prior to 2022. It's a pretty incredible demonstration of the immense agility required to navigate these fragmented global markets, basically locking in discounted prices wherever possible just to keep the economic engine running. But tactical pivots can only shield you so much from macroeconomic consequences. Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, spelled it out pretty clearly. She warned that a prolonged conflict in the Middle East, pushing oil to $125 a barrel, would essentially trigger their worst-case economic scenario. If energy flows remain disrupted, the IMF warns that global growth could slow to a sluggish 2.5%, and headline inflation could spike to 5.4%. To put that simply, everything from your weekly groceries to filling up your gas tank is going to get noticeably more expensive. Which really brings us to a critical question we need to keep in the back of our minds. How exactly does a localized conflict create a massive global economic shock? Well, the answer lies in the incredibly fragile, interconnected supply chains we all rely on. But to fully grasp that, we really need to zoom out and look at the broader map of geopolitical fractures happening simultaneously around the globe. Moving on to Section 2, Flashpoints and Fractures, a fragile global chessboard. As we just saw with the energy markets, absolutely no event happens in a vacuum. Let's impartially look at 3 key flashpoints unfolding right now. Over in Germany, the US is removing 5,000 troops, which actively tests European reliance on NATO and pushes Europe further towards strategic defense autonomy. Meanwhile, in the Ukraine and Russia, we're seeing unilateral Victory Day ceasefires, which really highlights how even temporary pauses in the war remain deeply contested and uncoordinated. And finally, in Sudan, drone strikes on the Khartoum airport have completely shattered months of relative calm. Each one of these isolated fractures adds severe, compounding strains to an international system that is already incredibly volatile. And alongside those military flashpoints, we are tracking some massive domestic pressures. In India, Prime Minister Modi's BJP has won the politically significant state of West Bengal for the very first time, totally reshaping national politics. Up in Canada, Alberta's separatists just filed a petition with 300,000 signatures demanding an independence referendum. On the diplomatic side of things, the US and Iran are currently weighing a 14-point peace proposal, mediated by Pakistan. And in China, the country is reeling from a tragic fireworks factory explosion in Luoyang that killed 21 people, prompting major internal rescue and safety overhauls. These internal shifts and tragedies force nations to reshape their priorities precisely when global cooperation is needed the most. This takes us to Section 3, the inequality gap, the human cost of economic shifts. To really understand how these compounding economic shocks, like that inflation and those energy prices we talked about earlier, are widening domestic wealth divides, we need to quickly define our metric. We use the Gini index. It's just a statistical measure of economic inequality where 0 represents perfect equality and 1 represents maximal inequality. Now, while official narratives often point to a sharp decline in inequality, recent data from 2023 to 2024 places India's consumption Gini index at a concerning 0.29. That is notably higher than the World Bank's estimate of 0.25. So the crucial takeaway here is really highlighted by this widening consumption gap. The economic growth story we often hear about is actually highly concentrated. The top 10% of the urban population now accounts for 27% of total non-food expenditure, and that's driving a localized economic boom for the manager class. But contrast that with the bottom of the rural sector. Down there, the mean monthly per capita expenditure is a staggering 9 times lower. So the rural and agricultural sectors are left incredibly vulnerable to the exact inflation spikes caused by the global energy shocks we looked at right at the beginning. Okay, so while global markets are bracing for an economic contagion and everyday citizens are battling this inflation gap, how are global health officials battling a literal contagion? Well, this brings us to a real-time crisis currently unfolding out on the high seas. Section 4, a cruise ship contagion, the MV Hondias haunt virus outbreak. What started out as a simple birdwatching trip in rotten America has sparked an international public health scramble involving the WHO and multiple national governments. Let's just walk chronologically through the timeline of this outbreak, because it's pretty wild. On April 1st, the ship departed from Argentina. By April 11th, the first passenger tragically died on board, though the deadly Andes hantavirus wasn't immediately suspected. Over the next few weeks, the ship traveled to St. Helena and eventually dropped anchor off the coast of Cape Verde on May 3rd to evacuate the severe cases. Now, as of May 7th, the ship is heading for the Canary Islands, hoping to finally dock this weekend, with 146 asymptomatic passengers and crews still confined to their cabins. Now, despite all the tension, Dr. Tedros at the WHO has publicly assessed the broader health risk as low. But just look at how a crisis like this tests our global systems. Health officials from 12 different countries are currently scrambling to trace 30 passengers who disembarked early in St. Helena and just slipped back into normal life. It is a massive multi-nation effort that relies entirely on international cooperation, which ironically is the exact same cooperation currently being tested by all the geopolitical fractures we discussed earlier. All right, finally, Section 5, regulating the future, tech, climate, and solutions. We've looked at energy shocks, wars, inequality, and even disease. So how are global governments and innovators actively trying to future-proof the globe against these overlapping crises? Well, the European Union is tackling this with a massive legislative and financial push. On the tech side, they've just finalized the AI Act. This sets firm boundaries by outright banning non-consensual AI notification apps to protect citizens, and rules for high-risk systems are rolling out by 2027. Over on the energy side, they are aggressively funding the clean energy transition to finally escape fossil fuel dependencies. They are pouring 1.09 billion euros into a hydrogen bank, they've approved 5 billion euros for German industrial decarbonization, and they're injecting 380 million to support French clean tech manufacturing. Meanwhile, out on the global climate front, the UN is expanding its Methane Alert and Response System, or MARS. They are utilizing AI alongside a network of 35 satellites to actively identify global methane superemitters. It's an absolutely crucial environmental update, and we know it works because the system recently pinpointed an Indian landfill in Kanjurmarg as one of the world's absolute largest emitters. It just goes to show that advanced tech can immediately direct rapid mitigation efforts to slow down global heating. And finally, we are seeing technological innovation acting as a direct response to the supply chain weaponization we discussed in the energy segment, really bringing our whole Polycrisis narrative full circle. Traditional drone imaging relies heavily on germanium lenses. That's a material deeply tied to Chinese supply chains and extremely vulnerable to export controls. But a startup in India called On Space Labs has developed brand new indigenous tech using something called chalcogenide glass instead. It provides the exact same high-precision thermal imaging, but ensures complete self-reliance and total immunity to geopolitical pressure. And that leaves us with one final, overarching thought for today. We have traced the dominoes all the way from energy choke points to military flashpoints, through widening wealth gaps, a scary viral outbreak, and the intense race for technological autonomy. So, as these global shocks continue to compound and interact with each other, are our traditional systems agile enough to survive the era of the polycrisis? It's a fascinating and maybe slightly terrifying question, and it's definitely one we are going to continue exploring. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.